Hello! Hi. How's everyone today? Haha. We do be being here, though. Hope the music levels are alright. They look like they're probably fine. If it's a little too loud, let me know. Kudasai. We're gonna give it a few more minutes to warm up before we start. Though this is really just me rambling. But, you know. You know. Ba-da-ba-dum. I love my music. It's so fun to listen to. It's a good time. Bop. Alright, like one more minute. Or 30 seconds, something like that. And we'll get to chatting. I don't know how long this stream's gonna be, but I have some thoughts and opinions. And I just wanted to talk. And it's hard with COVID and living alone. You don't really have many people to talk to. Alright. 15 more seconds. Boom. Ba-da-ba-dum. Boom. Alrighty. So today, I want to talk about a group of books by an author named David Eddings. The books are often accredited to David and Leah, or Lee Eddings, his wife. I guess after writing the first several ones, he was convinced to acknowledge that she was helping him write them so much that she deserved a full credit. I don't know the politics behind that, but eventually the book stopped being by David Eddings and started being by David and Lee Eddings. Or Leah? David and Lee Eddings. I think that's her name. Yeah, Lee. It's Leigh. Which is an interesting name for a woman. I think it's very cool. They wrote many books together. David Eddings, at least for me, is famed for writing two separate book series. There's a two-part trilogy, which what I mean is there are two parts to the story, and each part is a trilogy, which are the Elenium and the Tamuli, which are two book series that are connected to each other, and each has 3 books. And then he has a double quintet in the Belgariad and the Mallorean, which are 2 connected stories that each have 5 books. And I think that's something we should talk about right away. I'm not going to be disparaging David Eddings too greatly, I hope, as I'm a huge fan of these books. I have read them, both of those series, probably more than 10 times, as they're very bite-sized, and I like a lot of the characters, and I like David Eddings' humor often. Not always, but often. Um, so I do want to bring up the fact that David Eddings learned how to write one story, and then he wrote that story 4 times. I just want to get that across. The Belgariad, the Mallorean, the Elenium, and the Tamuli are very much extremely similar stories. They are to the point where you can't read them and not go, huh, this hit a lot of the same beats with a lot of the exact same themes, with a lot of the exact same mechanics, in like a really weirdly specific way. And in the Belgariad and the Mallorean, this is attributed to the main premise of that story being a cycle. That the characters didn't realize was a cycle, technically, or at least all of them didn't realize it until the second series, the Mallorean. Whereas the people who knew it was a cycle in the first series, the Belgariad, assumed that they had ended the cycle with the Belgariad, when they had in fact not. So the cycle continued. The Elenium pays a lot less attention to the cycle, but it still hits very similar beats, I would say. And there has been a lot of talk online over the years of people wanting the Belgariad and or the Elenium converted to film. They're stories that have an average amount of action and a lot of dialogue and intrigue, with a lot of very character-driven moments. A lot of the stories that Eddings writes are built on the back of the dialogue between characters and exploring the characters, basically. Entire months of travel will often be condensed into 3 lines of text because it's more important to listen to what the characters have to say and what they're doing with each other outside of travel. Fights aren't extremely descript with David Eddings. It's not R.A. Salvatore level of writing where each pivot of the heel is described in immaculate detail to give you a full grasp of the fight as it's happening. The fighting to David Eddings always seems very secondary to his characters. They feel like he's writing a Marvel script kind of deal, where the enemies are often untrained and completely outmatched by the main characters. Fights are often described as being, the fight was more like a slaughter, really, and that's it. Like, the fights in David Eddings' books often get very little attention because they're not the point of the story. They're just there because violence is a part of each of these stories. For the most part. Even in the Elenium, in, like, the climactic fight between the protagonist, a knight, a church knight by the name of Sparhawk, with his antithesis, his rival, Martel, it goes a little bit more in detail, but not really. And the fight ends super quick with a single stroke after a few minutes, like, in-universe of fighting. But that's not really the problems I have with the series. People have been talking about wanting to get the Belgariad and the Mallorean converted to, or the Elenium and the Belgariad converted to film, in the wake of, like, Lord of the Rings and those old, Game of Thrones, those old style epics of fantasy. And I have some concerns about that. Beyond just being a fan of the books, which I am, and not wanting something I like to be ruined by film, Upon rereading these series now, because it has been a long time since I've reread them, there are a lot of problems with them that in today's atmosphere aren't good. And in the past atmosphere also weren't good, but were more accepted. And I think that you wouldn't be able to convert the Elenium or the Belgariad to film either through a movie or even a mini series or like an HBO kind of series or something like that without seriously deconstructing the novel and changing a lot of it to fit a modern audience. And I don't mean like, bring it up to modern age. I mean, there's a lot of uncomfortable things in it that the protagonists do or witness that I feel cross a line. And some of it might be my own personal hangups. For example, I don't really like rape in my fiction. I think anytime an author includes rape in their fiction, they're going too far just for shock value. Because it's something that is extremely triggering and traumatic for people. And it's terrible. And you can write about it, of course, because it happens. And I mean, especially in these fantasy war-like settings. But what is the merit in showing it to the viewer? I guess is my concern. You already have these people set up as villains, whoever the rapists are. Do we need to see them commit a rape? We already are rooting against them. We are already with the protagonists. We already dislike the antagonists. We are already rooting for that enemy army to fail. I don't think you need to cross that line to justify what happens to them. I don't know. It's a weird thing, and I think it's one of the problems with the Elenium more than the Belgariad. And that's good. I think if any of the two series were to be converted to film or TV, I think the Belgariad is probably the better choice. I think it still has a lot of problems, but notably less than the Elenium. Or at least the problems would be easier to handle. I guess let's continue talking about the Elenium, because that's the one most recently in my mind. As I just reread it this week. I picked my book up Tuesday, because I have a big old omnibus of all 3 novels of the Elenium in one big text. And I finished it just last night, because I took Thursday off. I just didn't read Thursday. I got to like the last 40 pages and just stopped reading because, I don't know, I do that sometimes. The Elenium is set around a character named Sparhawk, whose exact age isn't ever given, I don't believe, but it's heavily implied he's in his late 30s, early 40s. And he's very much a sort of, tanned, grizzled man with a busted nose. The sort you might imagine being played by someone sort of, ruggedly handsome. Not like a pretty boy. I've seen a lot of fan castings like consider like Gerard Butler for the role, and I'm like, Gerard Butler feels too pretty to be Sparhawk in my mind. Gerard Butler is just very pretty. In my opinion, I really like Gerard Butler, and I don't know if I could see him being the same rugged as Sparhawk, but that's a tangent. I will do that a lot. I'm sorry, it's part of my disorder. So Sparhawk is this church knight, a sort of paladin of sorts, one of 4 holy orders of the church. The Elenium, in particular, is very centered around religion, more than the Belgariad. And the idea of the church having military branches and being heavily involved in the politics of the realm. As much much of the story of the Elenium is driven around church politics and the schemes of clergymen to achieve higher positions within the hierarchy. Is kind of one of the driving motivations for one of the main antagonists, Ananias. So Sparhawk, we open the story with Sparhawk returning to his home after 10 years of exile. And he is a skilled knight, but he's also the champion of the queen, who should have ascended to the throne after the death of her father, King Aldrius, whose name is Alana. Right? And that's sort of where we start off. Hey, Feet! And we discover over the course of the story that Sparhawk, our main character, our titular gruff old man, who is not described as white, but very much white-coated. I'm pretty sure. Tan skin, but tan from work in the sun. Basically, in his past was punished by the king to, for some reason, chat isn't working. Why isn't chat working? There we go. Hey, Feet. Sorry about that. So we discover that Sparhawk had been punished. And his punishment was basically to become responsible for the princess, Alana, who at the time was like 5. Sparhawk realized very quickly that that little girl, who he thought would be a spoiled brat, was kind of friendless and being raised in an extremely hostile environment where everyone around her was plotting and scheming to gain control of the throne, and she really didn't have anyone because her father was extremely neglectful. Because of a whole thing where the king was being controlled by his sister, who he was fucking, by the way, because there's a lot of incest in this story too, or at least a fair bit of incest. So Sparhawk finds this little girl, not a spoiled brat, but a hardened child who's very stoic and is just trying to survive in a situation where the adults are being terrible. And he becomes extremely sympathetic, and in many ways falls in love with this little girl, and basically becomes her father for the next 3 or 4 years. Eventually, the people in positions of power realize Sparhawk is raising Alana to be a tyrant. He is raising her to be as strong-willed as he is, as cunning as she could be, and she's already a bit more intelligent politically than he might be. She is clearly becoming a lot stronger with his presence, so they create an excuse to banish him when she is 8 years old. He's returning 10 years later to find that after she had ascended to the throne, she became terribly sick and was dying. So his old mentor and Sophrenia, who is a woman who is a Styric, which is a different race of woman, because in the Elenium and in the Belgariad, the humans of the world are sort of divided by races, which are sort of like where they're from, and people tend to have different like appearances and habits about where they're from, and which you can already imagine is leading to some problems. Sophrenia is a Styric. I think that's how it's pronounced. It's like Styric. If you know how to pronounce that better than Styric, let me know. And she is the instructor to Sparhawk's Knight Order in the secrets, what they call magic, which is blasphemy to almost everyone else, but the Church Knights have special exemption from God to learn these heathen secrets to protect the faith. And it's a whole thing. And basically, the queen has become encased in a diamond throne that is impenetrable. And by slowly sucking the life out of the 12 knights life force is keeping her alive, they are sustaining her, and will be able to sustain her for about like 9 months or 10 months. Not a lot of time. So there's a bit of a time crunch in the story, which is good for film, right? It builds agency and action and a need for things to happen quickly. But we get into one of the main problems with the story immediately beyond the incest, which is the Styrics, which is a race of people in the Elenium who are pale skin, dark hair, but are described as... The way Edding kind of describes them, it's almost like a race of people who have autism. Which is an odd thing to say, but a lot of the stereotypes, in quotations, that Eddings uses to describe Styrics are sort of the key flags someone might notice in someone who is autistic. Which would be interesting as a whole thing, as these people just grew in a different place, in a different way, to the point where their thought process is completely alien to most other people. And it's cool if they weren't, brutally murdered by the idiot common folk for being different. Their villages put to torch and their people raped and murdered by commoners who were superstitious about them. And which the knights, for David Eddings' credits, our protagonists do not agree with this. The protagonists are against this, but they're only against it because they have a direct personal connection to members of the Styric race. They are raised and taught by one of them in their order to teach them the secrets. So they build an intense personal connection with at least one person of that race. And that, we really get the feeling that that's the only difference between them and a commoner when it comes to hating this other race. Is just that because they have this unique connection with her and they love Sophrenia and respect her so greatly, it has opened their eyes to accepting the race more as a whole, though they still think they're a little weird and different and still have their own prejudices. And that does happen in the book. They come across a small Styric village that's been put to the sword, and almost everyone in it has been killed or raped, and a small group of them had fled to the woods away from the attackers. And the knights are admittedly pissed, and they want to run down and kill the commoners who did this. But Sophrenia refuses to let them do that for her own reasons. She doesn't really like murder, but she is traveling with a group of trained soldiers whose whole job is murder. Just pointing that out. So they do some slight torture to the civilians instead, because she said not to kill them. And at least in this case of racism, our protagonists are against it. Alright? If the people we're rooting for are against the racism, that's better than the people we're rooting for being with the racism, you know? In a narrative way, in modern day, if you saw someone being racist, you would want the protagonist to be like, hey, fucking stop that, it's not okay. Right? Like, in a modern context. The problem is, the racism that is pretty rampant in the Elenium, this is the only case where the racism is, like, something the protagonists are against, and you really get the feeling that it's only because they have a connection to the race more than other people, and not just they understand that being racist is wrong. It's, no, we know better. We know these people are okay, but those other people, they're bad. Kind of deal. Which is a whole thing. And the racism goes both ways. Sophrenia, this Styric, ageless woman who's implied to be at least several hundred years old, if not a few thousand years old. Like, we don't know her age, and it's a running joke uh, where she'll mention being around for some ancient event. And they'll just look at her and go, how fucking old are you, by the way? And her joke is, you know I'm not going to answer that. Why are you asking it? And it's like a running gag. And it's actually not bad. Like, the running gags that Edding writes are usually pretty chuckle-worthy. He does know how to write a good comedic dialogue. But she's just as prejudiced towards them as they are against her. And one of the main antagonists is the people of a country called Zemok in the novel. And the whole thing is that the people of Zemok are Elenes, which are the race of Sparhawk and everyone else on that continent. The Elosian continent, for the most part, are Elenes, though they are also subdivided by where they're from, their countries. But they are, as a race, called Elenes. And you could be an Elene from a certain place, basically. So there are these two races of people. The Elenes, which are subdivided into many sub-races based on where you're from, and Styrics. There's also another race, but they don't get involved to the sequel series because they're on a different continent. And the bad guy race is Elenes and Styrics who have crossbred. Basically, it is a race of half-breeds who are both races. And this is seen by both sides as being disgusting. The Styrics and the Elenes both think of it as an abomination that the enemies have... And it runs both ways. The Elenes are disgusted that these Elenes are breeding with the autistic-coded Styrics, and the Styrics, who view themselves as far more civilized than any other race, are disgusted that they would be breeding with these violent pigs, the Elenes. And so that's, like, pretty fucked up, that you're gonna make your main antagonist a race of people who are unifying two groups and make that out to be something terrible. That has a lot of subtext to it that isn't good. And it isn't something that we really need in today's world, in today's political climate. For you to go, oh yeah, these people? Yeah, they fuck these people and made half-babies. What fucking monsters. It's like, oh, these people? Yeah, they're interracial. We kill them. And it's just like, that's not okay. The novels were written a long time ago. The novels were written quite a while ago. Let me look it up here, actually. The Elenium. The Elenium was originally released in... I mean, they weren't written long enough ago for me to, like, wave this all off. They were published in '89, originally. David Eddings was a fan of Tolkien a lot, but the Elenium, from my understanding, was published in 1989. So, like, yeah, they have a lot of... And again, it's a fantasy setting, right? These aren't real-world races. There isn't a race of people with pale skin and black hair who get overstimulated by loud noises, and if you surprise them, completely breaks their focus and thought because, there isn't a race of people out there who suffer from overstimming and whatnot, right? It's not racial. Yeah, these came in 1989 for the Elenium. And again, it's a fantasy thing. It's its own world. Well, I mean, I don't know if I give Lovecraft a pass either, but that's a whole different video. And again, like, Game of Thrones came out in the early 90s, late 80s, and it has a ton of rape and racial prejudices and whatnot. I'm not saying that these things aren't things that are okay in a fantasy novel, because they are, even if I think sometimes they cross a line. But a lot of people talk about wanting to see the Elenium turned into a movie or a TV show, and the same with the Belgariad. And I have so many concerns because the books don't hold up well today for a lot of reasons. So, the Styrics are racist against the Elenes. The Elenes are racist against the Styric. The Knights work closely with the Styrics and are technically being corrupted by their faith, but whatever. That's a whole religious thing. And the religion comes into this a lot because, again, we're dealing with church knights. I'm saying in air quotes with my hands, even though you can't see the model move them. So one of the big problems I have is this storyline, where the main antagonists are a race of half-breeds, basically, between two races, and both sides viewing that as being disgusting and terrible. Now, there are some, like... And this is a thing in all of David Eddings' works that we'll be talking about today, where the different types of people in different regions all have their own stereotypes built around them, and they pretty much fit those stereotypes. It's not as bad as just full-blown racism. It's more like how Canadians are extremely polite and they say sorry to everything, and, you know, you can't get a rile out of them unless you talk about something very specific to them, and then they'll pop off completely, right? Like that kind of stereotyping, right? The thing you might see in, like, Europe, where French people act this way, German people act this way, Spanish people act this way. And it's sort of like this melting pot of people who all look very similar for the most part, but are very different in culture, basically. And that's not as bad. That's fine in the David Eddings works for the most part. At least in the Elenium. It's worse in the Belgariad. And it causes some more problem in the Elenium, because there is a race of people called the Rendors, who live in a desert area, who are dark-skinned. They wear very African-styled clothing, or Middle Eastern, sort of like Afghanistan. Their women wear face masks. They don't show their face to people, that kind of thing. The men wear turbans and heavy robes. It's very much coded that these people are Middle Eastern or African, something in between that. Eddings sort of pulls from both places. I think Middle Eastern might be a more direct through line to the Rendors. Which is interesting, because Sparhawk spent 10 years there, in this other place, living under the sun, in the desert. But the problem is, the only people from Rendor that are ever viewed in a positive light are spies who are there from the Church Knights, who work with Sparhawk, and the woman he spent his time living with there. Yeah, exactly right, Elvish. Like, it's kind of a blend of multiple cultures. But I definitely get more Middle Eastern vibes out of what Eddings was going for here, at least with the Rendors. But again, the only people living in Rendor who we ever see in a positive light, ever, are spies from the Elen countries on the mainland, people who are from, like, the Orders of the Church Knights who are there serving as spies, and the one woman Sparhawk spent 10 years living with, or 5 years, 8 years, however many years he spent living with her, as sort of like her husband kind of deal, when he was recovering and surviving in exile under a different name. Every other Rendor is extremely racially, like, treated terribly. All of the protagonists feel that they're idiots, incapable of rational thought. They all act as if the time under the sun has fried their brains to the point where they can't think properly. They all seem as fanatical religious zealots, to their own heretical, blasphemous faith, which oddly enough is based around a shepherd, which I found funny because again, that's, Catholicism has a lot of pull in the whole shepherd motif. So the fact that the two protagonists, the two main groups of protagonists in the story, both have religions founded by shepherds seems extremely weird and almost cool when you think that maybe Eddings was trying to write some critique about Catholicism, but then he made them a race of half-breeds and a race of Middle Eastern people, and makes them treated like idiots as an entire group of people who literally just exist to get slaughtered by our protagonists as needed. And it's not okay. Especially given, like, what the early 2000s did to people in the Middle East living in North America and other places, and the horrors that happened involving the Afghanistan war and everything. You shouldn't put out a show where the group of protagonists are a group of white men who are all incredibly racist to Middle Eastern men. Like, that's just, it's not good. Like, it's not a good look. It's not pretty. And again, these are fictional races. They're not Middle Eastern, they're Rendors. But, like, you gotta find actors to play these people, and you have to make them match certain things they do, which fall in line with certain Middle Eastern cultures. And then our protagonists view them as idiot monsters that exist just to rage war upon as needed. And and though our protagonist never goes so far as to suggest genocide in the Elenium, there are characters in the story who get very upset that the church keeps preventing them from just going down and murdering everyone. And this is a running thing, where when they do complete the war against the Zemoks, that race of half-breeds, one of the kings is like, great, now we get to run them down and completely wipe that race out of existence. We'll clean up all these filthy half-breeds and we'll never have to deal with them again. And the church is like, but what if we just convert them to the true faith? Huh? What if we did a crusade instead and gained all these religious followers who then have to pay us tithes? How about we not genocide and instead convert? And I'm like, I mean, okay, their god was literally evil and killing them en masse in sacrifices and whatnot. A greedy god is better than a murderous god, I guess, but, like, still not good. Like, it's still just not good. And this isn't even we're not still at the part that I have the most problems with. And again, I like these books. They're a good read, but sometimes, especially now after reading them again, now that I'm not, in middle school, you have this wave of just discomfort where I'm reading it and, like, I could see people who don't like Middle Eastern people reading this and going, yeah, of course the people who live in the desert and wear those silly turbans do this. Right? Like, it just feels like the protagonists are affirming real-life prejudices. And that's not what your story should do if you're going to have these fictional prejudices. I feel you need to come up with a way to prevent that. And it's one of the things that I think if this did get converted to film, the script would need to address. They would need to play down the racism. They would need to maybe even create scenes showing the Rendors in a better light, and just show that it is a sect of the Rendors who are being used and controlled and manipulated. And show our protagonist being more sympathetic instead of genocidal. Like, I feel you would need to rewrite a fair bit of the dialogue. I mean, you're gonna have to cut a ton out anyways, because these are, like, 300-page novels, and converting them into, like, a 2-hour movie would be difficult enough as it is, without making a lot of cuts. and that could be great for the series. I'm not saying you can't make these into a good show or movie. I'm just saying to do so would involve having to rewrite a lot of David's work, or Mr. Eddings, whatever. David is dead. I don't know if he'd mind me referring to him by his first name. David Eddings died on my birthday in 2009, I believe. I'm not sure if they had turbans. I don't see. The problem is that the protagonist our narrator is Sparhawk, and Sparhawk has a lot more interest in women than just random men. So when we do hear a lot about the Rendors, we're either seen as them as being unclean, unkempt, wild zealots, because that's how he views them. Or we see they're women who are shrouded in mystery, covered up in heavy robes with, I forget the name, but the sort of masks that cover their face. And that's something he focuses on a lot in his memories of his time in Rendor, is the women waking up before the men in a ritual to go fetch the water in clay pots and whatnot, and them all having their faces covered and whatnot. We don't get to see much of the Rendors as characters, because they're not characters, they are fodder for the knights to kill, and antagonists, a wall for the people to overcome. And so I don't know if they're described with turbans. I don't remember specifically, and I did just read it. But again, Sparhawk's focus is never on male renders, and if they are, they're people who are directly in his way, and that means they're usually, unkempt, they smell bad, they look wild and crazed, they barely speak properly and whatnot, right? Like, the view we're getting of this race of people through Sparhawk is not good. Which is fine, because most of the people he's interacting with are the crazed zealots who are out to, be raised up in this holy war to wipe out everything and whatnot. But that's not everybody. It's just the people that Eddings chooses to show us, and that's a problem, because if you don't choose to show us the good in people, and you only show us the worst of a group of people, you're not implying there is any good, right? Like, I feel this is something that comes up when I discuss One Piece a lot. The Whitebeard pirates in One Piece are supposedly one of the strongest pirate forces in the world, but anytime they're on screen, they lose. Anytime we see them, they are losing a fight. They are dying. And it completely robs them of all this quote-unquote strength that they have. Because you're just telling me about it, you're not showing me it. And in Eddings' case with the Rendors, he doesn't even show it to us. Most of the focus is on the women, because that's what Sparhawk is focused on. And almost all of the men we meet in Rendor are either spies, who are working with Sparhawk closely, or they are religious zealots being rallied into this intense fervor to attack the North, being manipulated by Sparhawk's rival. They aren't choosing to do this on their own. They are being manipulated by the enemy, who is Sparhawk's old friend and brother-in-arms, Martel. So, not only are they being described as being terrible, but they are being armed and rallied to war by one of the ex-good guys, right? Like, a fellow knight who has been corrupted and gone to the dark side. And I'm like, this seems like the CIA inciting wars for their own benefit. Like, so that's one of the problems I have, is just that anything that has people who are coded as being Asian, Middle Eastern, or African, and then has the protagonists and the narrator viewing them in an extremely negative light, I get really hesitant about. Because this is the kind of shit that can influence people in a very bad way. Because for the people who are already sort of racist, they can look at this work of fiction and feel it affirms their decisions that they're already starting to make. And that's dangerous. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I feel the Elenium in particular would be harder to convert to film than the Belgariad. There is another problem with the Elenium, beyond these two very heavily racially charged things. And the rape, which again, I think that if you were converting this to film, you could easily, or TV, you could just cut out every reference to rape easily, and change literally nothing in the story except making it better. Like, the rape, though it's something that makes me uncomfortable, is also the easiest fix, in that because it's so superfluous, you could just cut it, and there wouldn't be any major change to the story. So more continued slight spoilers for the story. Sparhawk does eventually acquire an item that would allow him to save the queen. And they do successfully bring her out of her crystal throne and cure her of her illness. They discover that she'd been poisoned, but that's a whole nother thing. And they cure her. They save her. And she is reunited with Sparhawk for the first time after 10 years. And Sparhawk goes to return her ring, which is like a royal family thing that her father had. That when he died, he hid so that the people who were killing him, because he was murdered by his sister, who again he was fucking, he hid it so that they couldn't find it. And it ended up getting buried with him. And Sparhawk went to return it. And Alana, in her weakened state, barely coming in and out of consciousness after recovering, sees Sparhawk on his knees, putting a ring on her finger, and it's like, oh, I'm taking this opportunity. You just proposed to me. Perfect. And Sparhawk is like, wait, what? No, stop, what? And then the queen is like, hey, we're getting married. And Sparhawk is like, I'm in my 40s, you're 18, and I raised you. And she's like, are you saying no to me? And he starts going, well, I mean, no, but... And it's just, it's not good, alright? She uses her position of power to manipulate him into agreeing to marry her, basically. And then on their wedding night, as they're having sex, or before they're having sex, or after they're having sex, I don't remember, she brings up how lucky he is, because most men don't get to raise their own wives. And I'm like, whoa! This is not okay. That's not alright. You don't get to go, hey, you're pretty lucky, right? Most men don't get to raise the woman they marry into what they want. And I'm like, yo! Well, she's 18. She's legal now. She is legal in this world. But again, remember, it's a fictional fantasy setting. I'm sure she would have been legal since she was like 16 or something. But like, it becomes this thing that Edding does a lot. Where Eddings likes his age gap. And he likes his power gaps in relationships. Oh yeah, no, it's grooming. But again, Edding sees it as not grooming because it's the child who's forcing the adult to get married. It's the 18-year-old forcing the 40-year-old to marry her because it's what she's wanted. It's what she's always wanted. And he's like, I never wanted this. What the fuck are you talking about? What do you mean? But he never says no. He never refuses her. He never sits her down and goes, I'm not okay with this. He's just admits he guesses he's in love with her. And I'm just like, this isn't... this isn't okay. uh, really. And it's something that really weirded me out, especially when I read the line where she's like, wholly aware that she's marrying her father figure. And I'm like, I know you have daddy issues, Alana. Like, a lot. Probably shouldn't marry your surrogate father. And at first, against his will. Because again, he does try to refuse her. But he can't because of their relationship and how much he genuinely loves her. And it's just this weird thing. And, like, if this was ever converted to movie or film, it could be sort of changed by aging her up and making Sparhawk a bit younger. But it still doesn't change the fact that for a lot of her formative years, he was her father figure. Her only protector, her only friend, and, like, the man who raised her in the absence of her own father. And I'm just like, we deal with so much shit with celebrities getting caught, like, grooming minors. And shit like Drake and every horrible thing Drake does. Do you really think this is what we need? A 40-year-old white man who is a violent murderer? Because again, Sparhawk, while being a chivalrous knight, isn't above a bit of ruthless murder if he has to do it to get the job done. He would rather have an honorable fight with someone, but more than once he's like, well, I guess I need to kill this person, and if he has to do it, he'll do it. Right? Like, this isn't like, you know, he's not an accountant. He's a fucking soldier who is killing people for a living. A lot of people. Very methodically, as needed. And here's him marrying this 18-year-old. And it's just, it's like his daughter. And it's so weird. And like, even past me knew that was a little fucked up. But reading it now and seeing her tease him playfully about how most men don't get to raise their own wives. And I'm like, yeah, because it's fucked up. Like, don't act like this is a positive. And it's very clearly like a David Eddings fetish that's slipped into the text. Right? It's his desire to have them paired together for the sequel and whatnot. And Eddings really gets off on her having more power than him because she's the queen. But her also having less power than him because she's 18 and his surrogate daughter. And in Eddings' minds, I guess that just balances out, right? Like, this balances out the horrible imbalance of power. Right, exactly. And again, this is supposed to be our protagonist. I think the story could have been just as good if Sparhawk refused her and she fell in love with someone her own age. Like Barrett, a knight apprentice who had been traveling with Sparhawk, who had come under his wing, and he had sort of become the mentor of. Who all the knights who were traveling in the party had high hopes for, of him becoming a great knight one day. Who was absolutely smitten with the queen, and furious at Sparhawk when he found out that they were engaged. And I'm like, and Sparhawk has a conversation with him about that at one point, and he's just like, hey man, I get it. My wife's hot. And I'm like, this isn't a conversation. This is not okay. I was just, it really fucking, it would need to be changed. Honestly. And I don't know how they would be able to do that well without just making Sparhawk not marry her, but that causes problems for the sequel. Which again, spoilers for, at the end of the Elenium, at the end of that series, in the epilogue, sorry, quick hydrate break. Sparhawk and Alana have a child, named Danae. And Sparhawk is spending time with his daughter, who's about 4 years old now. And he realizes, his daughter's hysteric. And he has a moment of, what the fuck? And so throughout the whole story, there had been a Styric foundling, a little girl with a flute, who wouldn't give them a name, so they just called her Flute, and she wouldn't talk to them, who they rescued, sort of. And it's discovered over the course of the journey that she was one of the younger gods, named a Frail, who was Sephrenia, the Styric secret person for the Pandian Knights, the main group of knights that we follow. Her little sister, and also her goddess, and that this goddess likes to be reborn into the world every so many centuries and have a family and whatnot, because she just loves love, and being loved, it's her whole thing as a goddess. And she finds people are more willing to love little girls than grown goddesses, so she always ends up being like an adolescent. And she was traveling with them and helping them because she was trying to guide Sparhawk towards whatever destiny he might have. And he discovers that she is his daughter. And she basically explains that the poison that was used on Alana made her sterile. But they needed a kid to continue the throne, of course. And they wanted children because Alana wanted a child. So the goddess took it upon herself to make Alana pregnant with herself and then be born as their child. And it's kind of fucked, because Sparhawk is here having conversations with his 4-year-old, and it's a little weird. And it's just a whole thing. And he's discussing how the 4-year-old is a literal goddess, and how they can't possibly tell his wife, because it would break her fucking mind. And here's where we learn something that had been shadowed throughout the entire story. There is like a 12-year-old boy named Talon, who's like a thief, a street rat, who we discovered is the bastard son of Sparhawk's squire, who becomes a huge character in the story. And it's sort of foreshadowed throughout the whole story that Afrail has, like, pays a little too much attention to Talon. And at the end of the story, she implies to Sparhawk that when she finally lets herself grow up to be an adult woman, which isn't something she normally does, she usually hits, like, 9 years old and stops, because that's where she likes to exist at. But now that she's going to need to be a queen and foster her own child to take over the throne when she's ready to leave, she's going to need a mate. Her own prince consort. And she's like, yeah, I think it's gonna be Talon. And I'm like, one, you're 4, talking about how you're gonna marry a 16-year-old in 14 years when he's fucking 30 and you're 18. That's how age works. Yeah. But also, it's another one of these age power gaps, where, yes, she'll be much younger than him in appearance, but she's a fucking eternal goddess who's been around since the dawn of time. And Sephrenia has a relationship with the head of the knights, Vanyan, that they keep relatively secret, or they never really show until the epilogue in the sequel series. But again, Sephrenia is several hundred years old. Vanyan is like 50 or 60, right? And she treats him the same way she treats almost everyone. Like a child. Because to her, they all are. Right? And this is the woman who was, like, super racially against the Elenes and the Styric people fucking, calling it a disgusting abomination that they would breed together. But she's in love with an Elen this whole time, an Elene, or however you pronounce it. And I'm just like, the hypocrisy. I don't believe they have a kid, but, like, they very clearly enter a relationship. And it becomes a whole part of the storyline in the sequel, because we discover that her childhood friend, Zalasta, who is introduced in one chapter, in one page of the Elenium, was actually behind a lot of the bad things that happened and aiding their enemies because he wanted to kill Vanyan. He wanted to completely shatter Sophronia's mind so she would love him again. Because he's been in love with her for hundreds of years. But she fell in love with a dirty, pig-eating Elene. And I'm like, whoa! You're gonna sell your soul to evil deities, abandon your faith in everything that ever mattered to you, to genocidally wipe out a group of people because a lady turned you down. I'm like, that's not okay. But yeah, that's kind of why I feel the Elenium would be harder to turn into a film than the Belgariad. It has a lot of problems. The racism you could probably mostly deal with by just adding scenes of the protagonist being more sympathetic towards the Randors. Though it's harder to do with the Zemoks, the race of half-breeds, and all the racism between the Styrics and the Elenes, because it's where a lot of the comedy comes from, is them reacting to each other in sort of slightly humorous ways that are still kind of racist. Or at least play up their racial stereotyping. But the whole thing with him, raising his own wife, and then fucking a woman less than half his age after she bullies him into marrying her is just, like, a bit much. But their relationship is crucial to the sequel. And crucial to Afrail becoming their daughter, because she starts referring to Sparhawk as father, like, halfway through the series. And whatnot. It's a whole thing. The Belgariad, alternatively, I'll talk about here in a second. I need to hydrate. My throat's a little raw. Now, the Belgariad, I feel, would be slightly easier. On the one hand, I believe there's a lot less rape in the Belgariad. It might be brought up, but I don't think we're ever shown someone raping anyone. Whereas the Elenium, we see scenes where someone, is dragged off camera and raped. The Elenium also has a lot of body horror. There's a lot of cannibalism and, like, blood orgies, and a lot of orgies. Oh boy, there's like an orgy book in the Elenium where it's just like a bunch of animalistic heathens are writhing in pleasure and literally fucking each other to death for their deity. It happens like at least once a book, which might be hard to convert to film. Belgariad doesn't really cross that line for a very simple reason. The protagonists are much younger. Garion, our protagonist in the Belgariad, begins the story at about 14, 16, I want to say. Which causes its own problem, because I can guarantee you they wouldn't find an age-appropriate actor. We'd have to deal with, like, some late 20-year-old, young 30-year-old pretending to be a teenager, and fuck, I hate that. God, it's terrible and never looks good. It's bad, man. Hollywood fucking use child actors to play child roles, but also please stop fucking child actors. Fucking pedophiles. I really hate Hollywood and the whole movie scene, if I'm being honest. And I think most people in it need to probably die. Because there's a lot of really terrible people in the movie industry who rape a lot of children and do a lot of terrible things. And people really need to stop just ignoring that so that they can have blockbuster movies they like. It's real fucked up. So there's one problem I have with the Belgariad outright, is that 2 of the main characters are like 16. And I can guarantee you Sinedra, Garion's eventual wife, would not get an age-appropriate actress. They would definitely get someone older who looks way too sexy to be 16, way too adult, and definitely have her play a 16-year-old, 100%, because this is what the industry does with women. The story has a lot less rape, which is good. It still has a bit of racism. however. And in this case, at least in the Elenium, the protagonists for the most part are against genocide. It's some of their allies who are very genocidal, and they try to stop them and talk them out of it. They're still terribly racist, but they don't believe genocide is the answer. The Belgariad, alternatively, has, again, several races of people that are treated worse than others. In particular, there is a race of people who are very, like, Asian-coded. Sort of South Asian, Southeast Asian, sort of like Malaysian, that area. I feel, and there is a time where it's discovered that the queen of those people had been working with the enemy and betrayed them, the other nations. And the group of protagonists are like, we should really set fire to their land because they basically live in like a jungle. We should burn the forest down and kill all of them. Set our armies up at the line of the border and set fire to the jungle. And anyone who tries to flee the flames, we kill. And that's not something your protagonist should talk about in a serious manner as something they might do. Right? Like, this is the people we're supposed to be rooting for, actively considering genocide against an entire race of Asian-coded people, because their queen betrayed them. And I'm like, whoa! Fucking pump the brakes on that one, laddie boy. That ain't kosher. Right? Like, it's not alright. It's not okay. It's not alright to go, we were betrayed by this one person. I guess we should burn down an entire nation and slaughter anyone who tries to run away. And which is weird because someone of that nation becomes incredibly critical to the story. He is one of the destined allies of Garion. Though I believe he's referred to in the prophecy, quote-unquote, as maybe the serpent or something. So even then, he's sort of given a negative connotation for his alliance by being something that has a negative inflection in modern mythos, as being like a snake or a serpent. And here's where we get into the point where, like, if you were ever to convert one of these stories to film, I don't think you could do the other. Because, again, David Eddings knew how to write one story. Right? Like, they both end up dealing with fate a lot. In the Belgariad and the Mallorean, it is a prophecy that refers to people in abstract names. There's the bear, the thief, the snake, right? Like, the old wolf. And these relate to the characters in the story. And it defines what they're going to do. They all have a part in the story, and that's a huge part of David Eddings' writing, is that people have a role to fill at a certain time and place, and the people who understand the prophecies will try and manipulate those people into that position at certain times. In the Belgariad, this is a lot more subtle. In the Elenium, a frail will just fucking make people go places. It's a lot more heavy-handed. Also, in these two separate stories, the protagonists are somehow involved in something that is unknown to fate. In the Elenium, Sparhawk is referred to as, like, Anaka, I think, or something like that, or Anka, or Ankara, I don't remember. They used it only in, like, the last 3 chapters, and I can't remember it, even though that's what I read most recently. But basically, a man who is outside of fate. None of the gods with their ability of foresight in the Elenium know what Sparhawk is going to do. And that makes them afraid because it's uncertain what he could do, since they don't know what he is going to do. And at the end of that series, or the Elenium, he kills a god, which makes all the other gods realize they can die. The man who has no fate, who is not bound to any destiny, can kill them. And it's a huge thing for them. In the Belgariad, Garion is prophesized. He has a role in the prophecy. It's not like Sparhawk where he's like a no man, like a void in prophecy. Garion exists, but the prophecy doesn't know how the story is going to end. The prophecy just talks about who needs to be there with Garion to try and get him to the end of the prophecy, but then it doesn't know what's going to happen. Right? And that happens twice in a row. The Belgariad and the Mallorean is the same shit. It's literally replaying the same prophecy, just a new cycle, right? Which is why the stories hit a lot of the same beats, have to use the same characters, and feel very much the same. Garion surpasses the first. He manages to succeed and overcome evil. And then the second thing happens, and we learn in the Mallorean, that it's not really Garion winning. It's another neutral party suddenly becoming, like, to bear the weight of prophecy and make a choice at which side will win. And because Garion succeeded in doing everything in the prophecy, I guess it chooses him. I don't know, it's super kind of dumb. Like, don't get me wrong, the Belgariad and the Mallorean are still super fun to read, because, again, the characters are great. Barak is great. Silk is literally one of my favorite characters ever in anything, even though he's just a guy. He's just Talon. He's just Talon, but a prince. Which, like, again, Eddings tells the same stories in two very different ways. But the problem is, Eddings has about 10 or 12 characters he can write, and he just uses those characters in both stories. Silk is Talon. Barak is Kalton, or a mix of Kalton and Ulath. I forget the names of the two knights, but they're Bevier and Tinian from the Elenium. I forget their names in the Belgariad. They're not coming to me right now. But the stories are the same, right? You have these characters being built up around a singular focus. In the Belgariad, it's Gariad, and Belgareth, and Polgara. In the Elenium, it's Sparhawk. And each of these people are from the different races of the world, so that there's a bit of representation from everyone, for the most part. Not totally in the Elenium, because again, they don't use the half-breeds, and they don't use the Rendors. Alternatively, though, I believe the Belgariad does use everybody at some point, because they discovered that one of the king of one of the bad nations that they're fighting is actually, like, the brother of Silk, like the half-brother or something. A bastard that his father created when he was out gallivanting across the world because his wife was sick. So even though he's the king of the bad people, we discover that he individually is a good-ish person or something. It's a whole thing. And the Belgariad is better for utilizing those races that way. There's some issues, like the fact that Sinedra likes to run around naked, or is just very public with her nudity, which is a thing that Edding does. Like, some cultures do this, and her race in the Belgariad is very, like, sort of Roman-themed. Like, they have public bathhouses, that kind of thing, and, like an Olympics-type event where many people compete naked. So basically, the rest of the other nations are seen as prudish because they don't run around naked and whatnot. But she's 16, and I don't think he needed to have a 16-year-old girl running around naked around a 16-year-old boy from a different culture, other than the fact that he wanted to make her uncomfortable with her nudity, and he wanted to write about a hot 16-year-old running around naked. And I'm like, Eddings, quit being horny for 16 and 18-year-old girls. Like, just stop it. Like, whatever, man. So I think that would probably need to be changed a little bit or censored, maybe, because I definitely don't want to watch a show with a 16 or 18-year-old girl running around naked. Um, that's a minor complaint though. Those scenes could be changed easily or handled a lot more gracefully, or just handled in a way where they're censored to us, and that would be fine. And again, you could easily cut out the racism easily, and I don't think it would drastically change the Belgariad. I'm going to be rereading the Belgariad soon. I bought these books to take with me to Japan. I've been buying the omnibuses to take with me to Japan, and since I finished the Elenium, I might as well read the Belgariad now. So the racism for the Belgariad, probably a bit more manageable than the Elenium, because there's a bit less of it. The naked 16-year-old girl probably needs to get, dialed back a bit. An issue is that Sinedra ends up beginning to like Garion, but then she discovers that he is the heir prince, who her father, the whole storyline is that Sinedra's family made a deal forever ago with the throne of a small island nation called Riven, that each year, or whenever the princess of that house, reaches 16, she would travel to Riven to present herself to the throne, and should an heir arrive to sit on the empty throne, she would marry them. And it's something that Sinedra feels is insulting, that she has to be carted off like a piece of beef to sit before an empty throne, to be paraded around and mocked, which is true. But then they reveal that Garion is the heir to the throne, and the seat isn't empty, and she has to marry him. And suddenly this girl who, again, like Sinedra, liked Garion, is horribly against it. And it becomes another thing about power, where Sinedra doesn't like the idea of marrying Garion because he's a king and a wizard, or a sorcerer, or whatever they call them, and he has more power over her, and she doesn't want to marry him because she either needs to be his equal or his better. She won't be inferior to anyone. And I believe he does something to sate her by declaring her the queen or something. He's like, I don't feel that I'm more than you, but whatever will help you. Whatever will help us get through this together, I'm willing to do it. And that's fine. They make it work, and she was starting to be attracted and be into him romantically over the course of the story anyways. One of the big complaints with the Belgariad that gets brought up is sexism. It doesn't do the weird grooming that the Elenium does, and it doesn't do the racism as hard. But there is this overtone that women are inferior. In both series, a lot of male characters in the Elenium are like, women can't be fighters. Women ruling? I guess that happens. Queens can happen. But they can't really do anything. And they're usually proven wrong immediately. Because the women in the Elenium, for the most part, are very strong or take matters into their own hands. Belgariad receives a lot of complaints and issues because of two things. On Polgara, one of the strongest sorceresses in the world, spends the whole first half of the first book, the Pawn of Prophecy, living as a cook on a farm, living a sort of idyllic housewife sort of scenario. Sort of courting the farm's blacksmith, Durnik, who ends up traveling with her and ends up becoming her husband eventually. And this is one of the things that gets cited as being sort of sexist, where Polgara is this incredibly powerful, intelligent woman who is forced into a babysitting role for half of the first book, spends her time living in domestic bliss running her kitchen and whatnot. Now, I don't think that's a fair representation, because Polgara wants that. And that sounds bad, but the character of Polgara, once you've read the extra novels, Belgariad the Sorcerer and Polgara the Sorceress, she always felt sort of alienated from the world of her sister, because her sister chose to turn away from sorcery and the family business to get married and have a family and live a comfortable life, taking care of children and whatnot. And the whole backstory happened. Her sister's family ends up getting killed, and they manage to barely save one of the offspring, and they begin raising them in secret for generations. And it usually becomes Polgara's responsibility to take care of the descendant of her sister until they're an adult. So she ends up raising up a lot of little boys over the course of centuries. Because in this world, for whatever reason, once you unlock magic, you just stop aging. Or you don't grow old at the same rate anymore. You just sort of tap into immortality for some reason. I don't know. They don't really explain it. Or at least I don't remember them explaining it in detail. It's probably something that's just hand-waved over. And I feel Polgara's connection to the domestic life isn't just Eddings going, this is where a woman belongs. I don't believe that at all. I feel Polgara does that because it's something that connects her to her sister. She feels it's her responsibility to take care of the children of her sister's bloodline, but getting to raise them and be a part of their lives and be there with them in a familial sense, I feel is a connection that Polgara wants as a character. So I don't think that doesn't bother me, because I think it's Polgara's way of connecting with her sister, and it makes logical sense to me. Now, something else that gets brought up is how Sinedra, at 16, in order to create a distraction to allow Garion to slip into the enemy's country and confront the dark god Torak, or whatever his name was. I believe it's Kaltorak, which means king and god Torak. She raises an army. She unifies the other nations, steals her father's legionnaires, because again, her father's country is Roman themed, so they have like centurions or whatnot, legionnaires. The legions, I believe they're referred to as. She builds up this huge army and then leaves it to the kings to run the military campaign. And a lot of people think that that's extremely sexist, that she rose this huge army and was a very Joan of Arc figure, and then got pushed to the side by men because she's, a woman. She can't possibly lead an army. She's merely a figurehead for them to control the troops in the way that they need. And I'm like, she's 16. She's a kid. She's never run a military operation before. These men have decades of experience battling wars. Like, I don't know. It makes sense to me that she would step down and allow them to control the troops. Because if she didn't, a lot of people would probably die. Because she's a fucking kid. Like, it's not that she's a woman, it's that she's 16. Like, in my head, I'm like, I don't know. That's a complaint that I don't feel is 100% justified. But I'm not... I wasn't assigned female at birth, so I don't know. Maybe it is something that is serious to women, and I'm underestimating it. That could be fair. I'm willing to admit that from a logical point of view, the fact that she was able to rally these soldiers to her cause and then step back to let people with experience lead them seems probably like the most intelligent thing she could have done. Because I know if I was 16, I wouldn't want to control a multinational army of people in a military campaign when I've never done any military commanding before at all. I don't know. It's just something that bothers me. So, I guess overall is what I'm saying is that the Elenium would be really hard to convert to film, and it would need a lot of changes because politically, there's just a lot wrong with it. The Belgariad, I think, would be easier. I think there's a lot less racism to cut out, though still some. And I think a bit of work would need to be done to make those other races seem less terrible. Though they do that a little bit by, again, giving someone of each race a key feature in the prophecy. But also just the fact that Eddings' characters are so fucking similar. Because each of his characters is basically an archetype that he writes very well. But in the Elenium and the Belgariad, you'll run into characters who are just, oh, this is just this story's version of this character. Or, oh, this character is just this character, but slightly to the right. Like, they're so similar that when you read them together, it can actually be a little confusing. And then you get into the fact that the Belgariad and the Mallorean are almost exactly the same story, just in different continents. Because it's a cycle repeating itself. So while the struggles are different and the goals are different, it hits a lot of the same story beats. There's also some more weirdness in the second one where, like, Silk ends up marrying someone who he trained. Again, she manipulates him into a position where she finally snags him because she's been hunting him since she was like 12 and he started teaching her how to be a thief, right? Like a spy. Because he's a spy for his nation. And he was like her spy supervisor. Like her spy coach. And the whole time she's always been madly in love with him. And she spends her time in the book maneuvering him into a position where she can sink her claws into him and marry him. And it's just this, it's a whole weird thing where, again, a younger woman who views a man in a position of power over her as a father figure, deciding she's going to marry that thing. Slightly less bad than Alana, because I believe Silk's protege was at least almost an adult, maybe, when they were working together. But it's still kind of creepy. But that's in the Mallorean. That never happens in the Belgariad. So if only half of it ever gets converted to something, then it would be fine. And even then, again, they could just make her be an adult when she started training, and it'd be less creepy. Alright, I think I'm done. I've been rambling now for an hour and 40 minutes. My throat's pretty sore. Thanks for coming by. I just really wanted to get my thoughts on the Elenium and the Belgariad off my chest. They're fun books to read, but a lot of the messages in them, if you're not careful about what you're reading and analyzing and critiquing, that it has some dangerous thoughts and notions that, like, just need to be approached with an analytical mind. And that's not usually what happens with Hollywood, right? So, would I like to see the Belgariad or the Elenium turn into a film or a series one day? Maybe. I think I could probably write a good screenplay for the Belgariad. I don't know. I imagine the casting would be terrible and it would all be ruined somehow, some way. But if one of them did get converted, I would prefer it be the Belgariad. Also, young adult stories are just, like, much more key audience fodder, right? Like, the Elenium, the main character is like a bunch of 40-year-old men, right? They're a bunch of grizzled war veterans. The Belgariad has a lot more humanizing tone because we're seeing it through the eye of Garion, a young man. It's a coming-of-age story with magic on top of it, so it's just, you know, something that's a lot easier to pull in an audience. Alright. I am going to end the stream now. Thanks for coming by.